to welcome everybody, those who are in the house here at Makanda at the Graham Hotel, and those who are joining us online. I think some other people will join us a bit later. Welcome to the annual Neil Agate Labour Studies Lecture. The Neil Agate Labour Studies Lecture is named after Dr. Neil Hudson Agate, who was a young trade unionist and medical doctor who died in 1982. Neil Agate, coming from a family from Kenya, went to Grahamstown, as it was then, to Makana, for his schooling at Kingswood. As a young man, he was shocked by the brutality and injustice of the apartheid system. He studied as a medical doctor, but rather than parlay this into a career as a wealthy professional serving the suburbs, he worked in Baragwanath Hospital, now Chris Hani Baragwanath. He gave all of his free time to work for the trade union movement. He was an unpaid volunteer in the African Food and Canning Workers Union. As a young man of 27, he was among those pulled in one of the raids by the apartheid state, targeting dissidents, targeting trade unions. He was taken to prison. In those days, one of the things the old government did was detention without trial. And what that means is you don't get a lawyer, you don't get family visits, you don't get a charge sheet either. You are there indefinitely at the pleasure of the state. During this time, he was beaten and tortured. Not alone in this. Many people who went to prison, to places like the notorious John Foster Square, suffered this way. In 1982, he was found dead in his cell. An inquiry by the then government claimed it was a suicide. The family has never agreed with this. His trade union has never agreed. The inquest was reopened a few years ago, and it was established that he was killed in prison. Whether it was a deliberate killing or whether they just battered him too many times, tortured him too many times, we don't know. But we commemorate that spirit of a young man who turned his back on what could have been an easy, soft life and stepped onto the path to try to make a better country. As a South African, as a trade unionist, as a supporter of the working class, Neil Agate joins that line of heroes who have helped to bring us not a perfect present, but a better present than the past. I'm also pleased to say that we are partnering here with the Vuyisile Mini Workers School. This is an annual event, and it's named after another hero of the working class, Vuyisile Mini, from the Eastern Cape, a son of the soil, active in the African National Congress, in the South African Communist Party, then underground, active in the South African Congress of Trade Unions, usually organizing in Port Elizabeth, now known as Gqeberha. He was the East Cape commander of Umkhonto we Sizwe. He was executed in 1964. So we dip our banners for those who've come before us and remember the struggles and sacrifices that made things possible. This event, the school, the lecture are hosted by the Neil Agate Labour Studies Unit. The Neil Agate Labour Studies Unit also honors the memory of Dr. Agate and the spirit of Agate and of Mini. I'm not going to say much more then. We recognize that the country is in difficult times. Unemployment is at levels we've never seen before. Social disintegration in families, in communities, in the general society is very high. Fear, hopelessness are all too common. Many young people are suffering without any prospects, and we need to understand why. And to understand why helps us to work out what the solutions are. Now, as the director of the Neil Agate Labour Studies Unit, Professor Lucien van der Walt, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome our speaker, Andrew Murray. Andrew Murray was involved in the Neil Agate Labour Studies Unit in its early years. He works as an independent analyst and policy advisor. He was team lead on the recent Department of Trade, Industry and Competition study of industrialization and localization. It looked at 44 districts and 8 metros and was trying to see how to better align industrial policy instruments with local industrialization opportunities. He's worked with the Congress of South African Trade Unions. He's worked with the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. He's worked with the National Union of Namibian Workers. He's worked in universities in South Africa and in Namibia. He was head of research and then the CEO of ECSEC, that's the Eastern Cape Socioeconomic Consultative Council. And as somebody who's worked in the field of industrial policy, I think he can give us unrivaled insight into what has happened, what have people tried to do, and where we're going. So without further ado, I'd like us all to give Andrew a big round of applause. The format will be Andrew will give his lecture, and then we will take rounds of questions. And for those at the school, this will build on what we looked at earlier today. But we, of course, people who are joining online, please also raise your hand when you want to make a question in the question session or write in your question. So thank you very much. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lucien. Amantla. So I think this is working, yeah? Okay, perfect. Okay, comrades, look, I'm going to go through I suppose it'll be, I don't know how long I've got, Lucien, probably 25 minutes or so, 25, 30 minutes. Okay, even longer. If I start talking, I can talk forever. I think some of you know me. So I'm going to talk about industrial policy, but I think looking at the makeup of this group, I think we can also start getting into some of the other issues just outside of industrial policy proper, relevant more to township economy and cooperatives and the like. So I think we'll take it more on economic policy, but you'll see a lot of the presentation that I'm going to give is on industrial policy. But I think as we start getting into the issues, I'll try and look at some of the relevance for community and township economy as well. So just see now if I'm going to do this right. So that's the next slide. Boom. No. Third one. What am I pushing it at? Okay, great. You did. Okay, so I've got the pointer. Okay, so look, let me start off by saying I'm really humbled to be here today in a lecture in honor of such a hero, and just 30 years down the line since democracy. I think we've got a lot of hard questions to be asking, and I think that's where we need to be taking the lecture today, to look at, we're reaching the 30-year mark. What have we achieved? What have we done well? What haven't we done well? What needs to change for the next 30 years? Because I think we can all say we're not in a good space at the moment. I think Lucien was alluding to that, unemployment at an all-time high, the most unequal country in the world, no growth to speak of. And you're seeing all of that tension come out now, both within the elites themselves, so the elites squabbling over a cake that's shrinking and creating all kinds of conflict, and then obviously a class conflict also now escalating and increasing. But I'd like to hear from you, comrades, as well. I mean, where is the working class? Where are social movements? How do you see your role in terms of shaping the future? Because I think as I'm going to get into the discussion, you'll see businesses definitely stepping up at the moment to say things are falling apart, we want to get involved. And we don't know, is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And I think we want to kind of entertain a discussion on that towards the end, to look at, what sort of models do we take going forward, knowing now, as we do, that we're not waiting and dependent on the state to deliver or not to deliver. So what does that mean for communities, for towns, for townships, for organizations? What does it mean? And then how do you mobilize, and what do you mobilize behind? So I think that's a key kind of issue. We can go into the first slide. So I think, look, just to kick off, talking about industrial policy, and that was the focus of today's lecture. So I'll stick fairly closely to the brief on industrial policy. But we had with democracy in 1994, we had that big shift away from import substitution industrialization, which we had under apartheid. So, we had a very kind of a protectionist industrial policy under apartheid. And then we moved to a very free market oriented approach. So under Gear, the economy was opened up. We saw widespread disinvestment from all the big conglomerates. We saw their headquarters moving overseas, and we saw a lot of them downscaling and divesting from their manufacturing interests. So we saw that in relatively widespread across the country. And at the same time, you saw the shift. It was part of the strategy of government at the time that we had to kind of have export-led industrialization or export-oriented industrialization. And the key kind of argument there was that you had to lower import tariffs so that you could get cheaper input prices, and that would make you more competitive on your exports. So you saw tariffs come down, from around 28% in 1990 down to about 8% in 2006. So over literally a 15-year period, you saw tariffs doing that. So we went from this highly protected economy to a completely open economy overnight. And then you saw a lot of those decentralization incentives that had been put in place by the apartheid state. And we all know all of those decentralization points across the Dimbazes, the Isabelenis, et cetera, all across the country. We saw those incentives disappear at the same time. And, we were all part of that. And I think a lot of the comrades here would also have been part of that. And it was all good because we wanted everything apartheid to end and everything Bantustan to end, which included the irrigation schemes, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that dismantling of what exists, but nothing was put in its place. We opened things up and we said, okay, let the market now provide. And unfortunately, I think what we know is that the market didn't provide. What we had was, this unprecedented deindustrialization. And places like the Eastern Cape were absolutely decimated. And I think comrades will know the province, the Dimbazes, the Butterworths, just absolutely decimated, literally overnight. So you saw just in terms of national share of GDP of manufacturing moving from around about 20% in 1994 down to about 11, 12% in 2019, currently still around sort of 12%. And if you look at, your labor-intensive sectors, because that's really where the jobs were hit hard, your clothing and textiles, your leather products, your footwear. And there we lost, just over the last sort of 20 years, we've shed about half the jobs in those across those sectors. So manufacturing jobs absolutely decimated. And the idea, and I know we were fighting that battle with national government at the time. That was just when I was joining EXEC. So in about 2000, I joined EXEC in the research space in EXEC. And, we were fighting the fight at that stage with comrades in COSATU and NUMSA and others in terms of saying we need to prioritize industrial policy. And we were told in no uncertain terms, why are you supporting manufacturing? Manufacturing's gone, just go with what's pertaining. We're moving to a services economy. The world's moving to a services economy. So forget, you're not going to stop that, and we don't want any artificial incentives and, you know, instruments put in place to support manufacturing. And that stayed until, you can go on to the next slide, until 2007. So all the way from 1994 till 2007, we had no real industrial policy in South Africa. So you know, we just had everything dismantled, but nothing put in its place. So in 2007, that's when you had the National Industrial Policy Framework being put in place, the NIPF. And that started making a difference, and comrades will remember the industrial policy action plans, etc., etc. I know Comrade Rob Davies used to kind of champion those. And look, they definitely it did make a difference, and we'll look at some of the impacts that they made. But I think there was that recognition at that time that there was sort of premature industrialization, and that the state needed to get involved. So that was the kind of idea of the developmental state. And I think a lot of comrades in the early 2000s will remember those kinds of engagements and discussions. What would the role of the state be? How does the state intervene in the economy? You know, what is this thing called the developmental state? And at that time, we were still very naive, I suppose, and we saw kind of state-owned companies at the forefront of the developmental state, following the kind of East Asian models and the like, you know, where you had a developmental state. And I want to come back to what we mean by the state and what a developmental state could look like. Is that a desirable thing going forward, etc., etc., given our failures as a country to date? But those are kind of the, you know, what the National Industrial Policy tried to do: build industrial capabilities, you know, drive innovation and technological development, and then also integrate SMEs into value chains and supply chains, particularly global supply chains. So there was some thinking, and that's where you know, with NUMSA and others really getting behind the automotive sector. And probably that's one of the areas, even though some might say it's at quite a cost, it's one of probably the successes, relatively successes of industrial policy. Although I would argue that the supply chains in the automotive sector are not particularly deep. They're very much just at that sort of first tier level. So we very much focused and benefited the OEMs themselves and maybe those global first tiers. We haven't kind of deepened it beyond that, though. But that was the idea of the NIPF. Carry on. You can carry on. So just in terms of you know, what was achieved, probably if we look back at the IPAP, the various iterations of the IPAP, you know, definitely I think, and as I was saying, it probably is one of the successes, the automotive sector, although not very deep. But we've still got the OEMs here. And I know there's a lot of debates about the subsidies that go to that. Could they be better spent elsewhere? Are we really getting benefits, etc., etc.? But the other important thing, I think the decline in clothing and textiles was halted. So that rapid kind of decline. I know you will know De Garma Textiles, for example. I mean, De Garma in its heyday, I think that was 7,000 employees, you know, in the 80s. You know, went down to about 300 and something employees. Now it's back up to, I think, 600 or 700 employees. So it went right down, almost closed, and now it's back up 600-700. And those are some of the kind of impacts of the IPAP at the time. But generally, you know, whatever you're trying to do in industrial policy, and I think that's really one of the key kind of messages I want to put across today, you're totally dependent on all of the other kind of things going on, the so-called binding constraints in the economy. So we didn't have the energy crisis then, you know, and the logistics crisis. But we did have other kind of core constraints around skills then. and started kicking in energy, a little bit later, logistics constraints, etc., etc. And then undermined by macroeconomic policy. So, I mean, still today, and it's something that, we need to be thinking about. When you've got industrial policy almost needs to be the center of government policy. And then other policies take their lead from industrial policy. What you're trying to drive in the economy, how you're trying to restructure and transform your economy. That's what must drive policy. It's not another policy. It's not a sector policy, and then every other department's got their own policy. And then DTI must try and, coordinate and juggle everyone else. Industrial policy, the policy that's aimed at transforming the economy, at growing the economy, is the policy that takes precedent of all other policies. So all your infrastructure, your skills, they must align to your industrial policy. And even your macroeconomic policy should be guided by what you're trying to do in the broader economy. So, but we've got it the other way around, where macroeconomic policy takes precedent over everything else. And what you see with whether it's the allocative decisions of Treasury, it's only about 27% of the fiscal allocation that goes to economic services and economic activities, and much less of that on industrial policy. So I know there have been all of those fights for years between DTI and National Treasury around actually financing industrial policy. And especially for a country like South Africa, where you've got, key DFIs that need to go in and finance development. If they're looking at financing development, and always wanting to make returns on that, it's, they're always going to be chasing those big projects, those projects that are tied to the historical capabilities, those projects that are linked to what most people refer to as the minerals energy complex. And you'll see that continuity runs through in something like the Industrial Development Corporation. Instead of being more risky and going into new sectors, where there might be a higher impairment and the like. And, if we know our banking sector, if they've got a kind of impairment threshold of 1%. So typically, if they would set, and that's their shareholders set that impairment ratio for banks. So they're not going to put money into anything where they think there's not going to be returns on investment. So if you're a startup, if you're a new industry, forget it. You are not going to get finance. And it's been really difficult for new entrants to come into industrial sectors, set up manufacturing enterprises. It's been almost impossible. The financial barriers to entry, the capital barriers, because the capital has not been made available. And it's kind of ironic, because South Africa is an incredibly resource-endowed economy. There's like sort of 7 trillion rands of private banking, institutional investment, development finance. And if you listen to banks, they'll say we can't even get rid of the money we got. They don't have investments to take their money. Yet we know the need out there. So there's this huge gap, as it were, between capital allocation, if I can say that, and the demand, the need out there. And it's something that industrial policy needs to drive that and shape that. But instead, it's been shaped by the interests of, big financial capital and financial markets and the like, not by the needs of the economy. So I think now, over the last few years, you've got this shift away from RPAP to the reimagined industrial strategy, and you've got all of these master plans, and I'm sure some of the comrades will be fay with some of the master plans. There's about 18 of them now that have been developed. And look, I think the idea of having the master plans is a good idea, because you're getting into sectors, you're getting into industries, you're saying this is what must happen, these are the actions, you're committing the state across the state to do certain things, and you're committing industry to doing certain things. So I think that's a good thing. So you've almost got kind of industry level compacts, if you like. That's the idea behind these industry an interest in making sure that they actually get implemented. Because I think what we're finding in a lot of the industrial action plans is, non-implementation and kind of blame game across government, because we know that the state is not coherent, it's not joined up, and it's dependent on all other parts. We've got 3 spheres, and certain things must happen. Local government must do this, and another department must do this. And that's what we kind of call, if you look at some of the early critiques of the industrial action plans, that's one of the big issues, this issue of public coordination. So if we don't have a coherent state that, gets behind a set of actions in a particular industry or sector, how do you expect other players in that space, industry, private industry and the like, to hold its side of the bargain, in a sense? So you've got this kind of breakdown of trust, and I think it's a huge issue, because the state, as we know, following the kind of state capture years, is already, it has this massive trust deficit. So anything now where the state's coming in and trying to kind of lead, and it can't honor its side of what it agrees to, that trust deficit kind of grows. And I think it's a huge issue that we've got at the moment in the country. And look, everyone says, okay, DTIC, you must shift away now from playing a policy role and play more of a coordination role, or what we're seeing a lot of the time now, where the rest of the state is incoherent across the 3 spheres and across departments and state-owned companies, etc., etc. Some of those functions get centralized. So we're seeing a lot of that happening as well, the Operation Vuluntlele, etc., etc., where the presidency steps in and says, okay, well, we don't actually trust our government to run this, we'll take this. But, as we're seeing, I don't think that's much of a recipe for success. So I think there's a lot of hard questions about how the master plans can get implemented, the requisite authority, and accountability, ultimately. How do we hold the different role players to account? And I think that's something, and I'm not sure in your sectors as trade unionists, the extent to which you have, and I suppose it's probably something for NELSU as well. How are you kind of monitoring what was agreed? Because there's a lot of good stuff in these master plans, there's some really good stuff in there. So how do you actually hold the private sector, industry, and the state to account for what they said is going to happen? And are you doing that? I'll just be curious just to ask that up front. And then, obviously, if you look at, and I'll show you some of the data that we did in this last project I was involved in, where we went into the 44 districts and the 8 metros. But you'll see that the model is very much, we've got a model where you're interfacing with industry. It kind of happens at local level, That's the kind of the LED function, really, where, DTI is not coming down and interfacing with industry. In most cases, they'll say, okay, there's an SEZ, so the SEZ can interface with local industry. But that generally only happens in the SEZ. It doesn't happen outside of the SEZ. So that function is almost a function, at least constitutionally, of local government. But we know LED has been kind of cast more as, implementing a couple of projects, and some of them are good projects. I'm not knocking those projects, some livelihood projects, etc., etc. But your municipal officials, your LED officials, are not interfacing with local industry. They're not going to those factories and saying, so what are the issues? Okay, so you're in an industrial park, there's electricity issues. The roads are all falling apart, There's no fencing and criminals are vandalizing the assets every day, They are focused on their whatever piggery projects and this and this. They're not interested in what local industry is doing. So nobody is really talking to local industry. So and I'll show you some figures. There's amazing things going on, actually, And industrial policy must actually take guide from what's actually going on the ground. There's lots going on, If we just get behind what's going on, and probably, trade unions, because you are there on the ground in those factories, you've got a good sense of what's going on. And because your unions are organized, and I won't say more organized in the state, let me not say that, but you are organized and you've got more of an interest, let me say that, than the state in making sure those industries and factories and firms survive and are sustainable. So is there a role there for COSATU to play in terms of, and I know there's big debates around that sort of co-governance and, but I think, it's like backs to the wall time, And I think if we're not prepared to kind of get out of old models and how we work, and then we're just watching things close under our eyes. Okay, next slide. So look, I'll put a few, I'll just run very quickly through these, but 30 years on, I think we can all agree that the economy hasn't transformed. Yes, there's been a lot of good things that have happened in the last 30 years. We are democracy, access to services, maybe not quality services, but there have been things that have happened in the last 30 years that I think we can all be grateful for. And I think those kind of things we need to consolidate and protect as well. I think particularly the democratic gains, because you do hear, as much as you hear about the sort of East Asian models and the like, and I'll come to those models just now around industrial policy, you also hear these whisperings, maybe we became too democratic too early. Maybe we should have transformed first, and then a democracy can come later, etc., etc. And I think those are, for me, those are quite dangerous debates to start getting into. But I think it's something that we can engage in afterwards. That sort of relationship between economic transformation and democracy. Because I think it's a key debate and a key discussion that we need to be having now. And it's a good moment, 30 years after democracy, to really start thinking afresh. If we are going to think about the next 30 years, and maybe we think, okay, the last 30 years was about democracy, it was about political stability and all of that. We didn't have war, all of the institutional state building, even though we know that went a bit haywire along the way, but that was what the last 30 years were about. The next 30 years are about economic transformation. Now, what does that mean, if we're saying that? And then what do we need to put in place from an institutional perspective to realize the kind of economic transformation vision, if there is one? And I would ask comrades here, what is the economic transformation vision? Do we have a vision for where we're going as an economy? So just in terms of some of the big issues, I think firstly, just on diversification, we're still very kind of minerals, energy complex dominated. Yes, we've diversified more into services, but those are high skill services. We're competitive in those. And where we are more competitive, even in the manufacturing space, where we have diversified, is in the sort of higher productivity, more kind of tech manufacturing spaces. So the implications of that have still been kind of job loss. And unfortunately, our labor market policies, particularly our schools and education systems, haven't kept track. So if we want to move into a high productivity sort of manufacturing economy, then we need the kind of labor market to support that. And at the moment, we've actually found that there's even skill shortages in those kind of high productivity spaces. And that we can look hard, and we need to be looking hard at our education and training sector. So I know that I was looking at a figure the other day that 3% of schools in the country produce more maths and science distinctions than the other 97% combined. So we've got 3% of the schools are kind of schools of excellence. And then we've got, the rest that are not producing the skills that we need if we're going to move into that higher productivity, competitive kind of manufacturing space, which we have to if we're going to compete globally. But I think we can engage with that. So second point I'm making there, we haven't overcome our path dependency. So we've still got this kind of commodities dependent, mineral commodity dependent path dependency. We developed as that as South Africa, and we haven't overcome that. So if you look, people like Simon Robertson, others write about that. About 60% of our merchandise exports now are in are commodities exports. So, when there's commodities upcycles, it's good times. And all of you will remember those early noughties, 2001, 2002, from about 2002 to about 2007. There was that massive commodities boom, global commodities boom. China was kind of investing sort of 50% of GDP, fixed capital investment. Massive. China was just going absolutely nuts. And I remember visiting China a couple of times during that period. Everywhere you look is just building sites. It was absolutely nuts what was going on there. But for a country like South Africa, it was, boom time. It was, we were growing at 5%. There was surplus money, and everyone, even unemployment was coming down. And I know we had all those debates with Kusatu at the time about jobless growth, etc., etc. But I think the statistics do show that it wasn't the kind of growth that we needed, because it wasn't growth that built new capabilities. And I do say there, for me, those, I know we all talk about the Zuma years as the wasted years, state capture, etc., etc. But maybe those were the real wasted years, because we actually had this massive fiscal surplus. It was boom time. But what we didn't do was take that surplus and reinvest it into new industrial capabilities. And I think that's the pre-national industrial policy framework times. So if we had industrial policy, if we didn't have that kind of overarching neoliberal kind of paradigm that we were operating in the 90s and early 2000s, we would be a different economy today. And it made our job difficult as people engaged in the policy space at that time. Because when you engage with National Treasury, they would say, what's your problem? We're growing at 5%. Why are you bringing this why do you want industrial policy? Things are working perfectly. Look, we've got growth, unemployment's coming down. Well, just, be grateful that you're getting, we can give bigger transfers, etc., because the fiscus is flush at that time. Okay, carry on the next slide. So that, I've just put that slide in. I know it's a busy slide. Oh, no, this is working now, is it? Okay, you can go into that. Let me just see. Okay, so let's go. I was thinking that because it did kind of move there. Okay, so I've had that. Okay, so this, and I must just see the middle one is there. Okay, so it's a very busy slide, so apologies for that. But the green one at the bottom there, and you'll see there, the green moves more or less in line with the global economy, well below advanced economy, well below the emerging economies and the African economies. But you'll see, and I won't, it's hard to see, but there's that kind of growing gap there between the South African economy and the global economy. And that's when our own sort of constraints start kicking in. So we were more or less growing with the global economy because we're so tied in to the global economy, because we are a commodity exporter. So we're so tied into what's going on in the world. World goes up, we go up. World goes down, we go down. But then since about 2014, even though we've been going down, so we've been on a big kind of commodities down cycle since about 2012. Okay, we only started feeling it from about 2014, 2015, because we had that little bit of fat in the coffers, and we ran a slight sort of counter-cyclical fiscal policy at the time. But since about 2015, we've really been feeling it, and we've been growing much slower than the world as a whole, and nowhere near the other emerging economies and the rest of Africa, etc., etc. And that's what's got us into the dwang that we're in now, where we're growing it, whether it's 0.1 or 0.4, you hear these different projections for this year, but we're in deep crap, actually, as an economy, with the kind of growth we're getting, and the macroeconomic kind of policy stance that we've got. It means something has to give, and we'll see what gives. But we've got kind of increased pressures for social relief, and particularly the social relief of distress grant. We've got bailouts to state-owned companies that's increasing and is still projected to increase. We've got debt servicing costs, going up. So Treasury and the fiscus is in an incredibly tight bind at the moment. And I think, it will be interesting to get a sense from comrades, how we think what we need to balance within the fiscus. And then obviously there's the monetary policy side that we've got at the moment as well, where we've got a very kind of hawkish monetary policy in South Africa, where even though a lot of the inflation drivers in the country are external, oil price and the like, it's we're jacking interest rates all the time. And I think, for those who are indebted, whether it's households feeling the cost of living crisis or whether it's businesses, and I think businesses are under incredible pressure at the moment, and you're seeing job loss everywhere. I'm not sure if you guys are still monitoring that. I know at one stage you guys used to monitor job loss at least in the Eastern Cape. I'm not sure who's monitoring it at a national level either, outside of kind of Statistics SA, where you get your quarterly labor force survey kind of data, etc., which is just showing unemployment going straight up. But we're really, really in the dwang at the moment, and we need to be thinking about things very differently. we can't just continue, this thing. If you just continue doing the same thing and expect different results, that, what do they say, that the definition of, what an idiot, of insanity, exactly. So we're in that kind of insane space at the moment as a country, looking for new ways of doing things. Let me see now. Yeah. So, I mean, even so, the National Development Plan, and I know we were quite critical in those days in 2013, 2012, 2013, when the NDP was coming out. I know we were engaging hard as the Eastern Cape, as EXEC, etc., on what was in the NDP, and the lack of kind of focus on industrial policy and on inequality reduction, But nonetheless, even the NDP, they've just done the review. I'm not sure if some of the comrades have been following the review of the NDP, the 10-year review. But you'll see there, I mean, all of the indicators are not looking good. So we've got a target of fixed capital investment of 30% of GDP by 2030. We're currently sitting at around 14%, down from 19% in 2010. So fixed capital, and if you're not investing in your economy, so nobody's investing, and that's the kind of bind that we're in at the moment, I think, where capital is not putting money into the economy, not expanding, especially not in the productive economy. They might be putting it into stocks and bonds and all the funny money, dividends and the like, but they're not putting it into fixed investment. And a lot of the fixed investment, even of this 14%, you'll find a lot of it going into, for example, the wind farms and the big renewable projects, which is good because it's taking us in the right direction in terms of greening the economy, carbon reductions, etc., net zero targets. And that's a good thing, I think. But, so even this, what we're seeing at 14%, and I know the 1.5 trillion targets for the last 5 years, etc., which we hear have been met, a lot of that is this kind of investment. It's not productive economy investment. It's not investment that creates jobs. It's not investment that creates new value, economic value. And I think that's really where things are at, and where we need to be having kind of conversations, I know Marta Sen talks about kind of democratic public reasoning. What's the reasoning that's happening in society around this that we're facing? We're facing an unprecedented crisis, and something's going to give. And what is that gives? I think that's what we're all watching, Are we going to take some weird kind of very sort of, populist kind of route? So I think, and we can talk about, I think, the politics of what this means, at the end. So also just in terms of basic things, our competitiveness as a country is in decline. So we were 37th in the world in 2005. We're now 62nd in 2021 in terms of World Competitiveness Report. So our competitiveness as an investment destination has dropped. And I think we know what's behind that, mostly around kind of logistics capabilities, energy supply, etc. I know people do kind of point to labor market as well, but I think there's some interesting stuff around productivity, around unit labor costs and stuff. I saw Anthony Black had done some stuff, which shows that we're actually quite competitive on that front, relative to other areas of non-competitiveness, ports and the like. Obviously got to do with our worsening state of economic infrastructure. That's an absolute crisis, lack of investment in economic infrastructure. So again, maybe those early wasted years when we had the surplus, we didn't seem to build industrial productive capabilities, and we didn't invest it into power generation and the like, So that's a massive kind of issue at the moment. And the solutions, and I'll talk to the solutions later. What I would like to ask you as well, what are the solutions? Because you're finding business stepping forward now, Business for South Africa, saying, okay, state failed, we'll step in, and it'll be interesting to kind of get a discussion going on that. And then obviously the balance sheets of the state-owned companies. We know that their balance sheets are shot, the ability to reinvest in fixed capital. And I think we're seeing there's about 4% of GDP that's state fixed capital investment in the economy. So way too low. I'm saying it's just, we can't build an economy where the state invests 4% of GDP in fixed capital. Forget, it can't happen. So we're in that kind of space at the moment. And then obviously current global conditions, so you got very kind of high global inflation, high interest rates in a lot of the industrialized countries, the US and others. So you're not seeing the flows of foreign direct investment that we were seeing in the past. And then, obviously the nearshoring and all of that, the new geopolitics, massive, deglobalization, keep production at home. Those are real things that are out there at the moment. And if you're not our friend, we're not going to invest, And those are real signals that are coming. So it's a whole new ball game out there from a kind of foreign direct investment, geopolitical space, And again, it weakens us as a kind of taker of foreign direct investment, how we kind of interface. At the moment, the Eastern Cape is kind of citrus to Europe and automotive, and not much else. And that's like a couple of OEMs, And, if geopolitics starts influencing their investment decisions, I know Mercedes, we're still waiting. They should have already told us that the new post-27 model, they've communicated their other models. They haven't communicated East London yet for the 27 onward. That's Mercedes-Benz 25% of Buffalo City's economy in its expanded supply chain. So you kind of take that out of the equation, boom, we become a rust belt. And those are real kind of concerns at the moment, how the geopolitics plays out. And I think our capabilities, let me say, to navigate those, because it's not just about the geopolitics, it's also about how we navigate those. But also, without being held ransom, gun to head, you do this or we don't invest. But that's where the world seems to be going on a lot of those. So just in terms of some of the concentration issues, I think we're still this incredibly concentrated economy. So I just put some of the stats there. And again, this comes from the NDP review. So top 10% of businesses in the country earn 86% of total income. So 10% of companies, 86% of income. I mean, that's the level of concentration that we have in the South African economy. So the bottom 50% of businesses earn less than 2% of income. So you can see the kind of absolute kind of crazy concentration we have in South Africa. And then you'll see like market share. So you talk about market power, where a couple of big conglomerates assert a power within different value chains. So you see that in the supermarket retail space. You've got four big supermarket chains. Woolworths, Shoprite, Pick n Pay, and Spar. Four big kind of supermarket chains, and they basically run those supply chains all the way from what's produced at the farm to sold in the supermarket. They run those supply chains, and until recently, and that's great, Competition Commission, and hats off to the Competition Commission, because they are taking on some of these issues. But you would find even those big supermarket chains, they would sign exclusivity agreements with shopping malls, that they would be the only the only retail outlet at that food retail outlet, supermarket retail outlet at that shopping center, or even in proximity to that shopping center. So it kind of shut out the independent retailers. It shut out the spaza shops, especially when shopping malls started going into township economies as well. So I think this is a kind of a big issue here. And then the same with the banks. The banks, the top 5, have increased from 74% of market share to 90% of market share currently. So you're seeing the banks expanding their market share, and the same with the big 4 supermarket chains. And you could take other sectors as well. I was just giving that as an example. So you'll see this market concentration, and that's one of the sort of paradoxes that we have in South Africa. And I think from an industrial policy perspective, we need to be thinking about that, where you've got very limited black participation in the productive economy. So even if you look at the BBBE Commission report, and that's of the 150 JSE entities, the 43 organs of state, and 6,000 private entities, black ownership of the economy sitting at 29%. That's 30 years later, and less than 2% of JSE listed companies black owned. And then when you get into your Gini, which is your measure of inequality, your typical measure of inequality, we've kind of sat at around 0.69, which is the most unequal economy, most equal society from an income perspective globally, at least on the ones that are measured by the World Bank and others. But when you really get into your property Gini, or your financial asset Gini, that's where it gets really scary, where you get your property asset Gini, that's at 0.88. Your financial asset Gini at 0.92. Now, 1 is perfect inequality, 0 is perfect equality. So if you're at 0.92, or if you're at 92 and 100 is perfect inequality, that's where we're at with regards financial assets. So I'm saying that's the country that we're living in. And, that needs to take center stage of industrial policy, and needs to take center stage of economic policy going forward. And I would argue that it's not, we must get away from kind of, well, it's fine if we grow, we will reduce inequality. That's kind of the NDP logic in a sense. We got to get growth and then we'll get inequality reduction. I think if you look at, Piketty and others, if you've got this inequality, you're not going to get growth, So inequality itself is probably our biggest constraint to growth. So we have to kind of look much more at sort of, how are we going to tackle inequality as a society? What is it? What does that mean? Okay, then just in terms, I put some of these things just to kind of give you a sense of where we at. So let me just go to this one first, I think, before I give you a quick rundown on the provinces and stuff like that. I think the other thing we've seen over the last 30 years is some spatial economic shifts. So some of the spatial economic shifts we've seen, you'll see here, for example, Gauteng has gone from, I must just look there, what's that? That's about, 31% of the national economy, and that's increased to just above 35% of the national economy. So the gray line there is Gauteng, so the contribution of Gauteng is going up. The contribution of KwaZulu-Natal is also going up, although it's dipped down in the last couple of years. And the Western Cape is going up. So you're finding those 3 provinces are increasing their share of national output. All the other provinces, their share of the national economy is going down. And this one is really gone down, the Eastern Cape. And it's something that I think, I think a lot of the comrades here are Eastern Cape comrades. It's something that we really need to kind of get our heads around what's going on in the Eastern Cape. But you'll see those are all that's the Eastern Cape there going down, and you'll see all the other provinces. That green one, the Northwest, is probably the fastest faller there. But so we've got this spatial kind of unevenness. So besides just inequality, asset inequality, we've also got spatial inequality that is growing, and I think it's something that we have to get our heads around. Again, the general argument that you hear when you engage is that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we must focus on the 5 big metros, Ekurhuleni, Joburg, Tshwane, eThekwini, city of Cape Town. Unfortunately, none of our metros fit into that. But generally, you say the general argument goes that's where the economy is at. Sort of 60% of the economy is in those 5 metros. That's where we need to focus our attention. Put resources in there. So I think we need also to be thinking as we kind of unpack what the next 30 years must look like. What do we see from a spatial perspective? Okay, that's just the Eastern Cape, very much tracking South Africa growth, but a bit lower than South Africa growth. Look, I just put this slide here. This is, it's a complex slide, so bear with me. But the point I want to make is in some of these, like this is Alfred Nzo here, you'll see kind of 38% of Alfred Nzo economy is community and personal services. Another 15% or 16% is government. Another 18% is trade. So if you kind of or finance, insurance, and then another 16% trade, that's all off kind of government, if you like. So almost the whole of Alfred Nzo economy, district economy, is government and trading off government. If you look at that, these few little ones down there making up about 8% of Alfred Nzo economy is the productive sector, agriculture, manufacturing, and the like. So if we continue with our fiscal austerity and budget cuts, etc., what is going to happen here, to an economy that is totally dependent on government spending for its entire economy? And it's not just Alfred Nzo. If you look, they all like that. That's the Eastern Cape. Chris Hani, O.R. Tambo, in particular, Joe Garby, those 4, all the ones with the former Bantustan. Even where we are now, Sarah Bartman, a little bit more diversified there. You can see about 11% manufacturing and 8% agri. So Sarah Bartman's actually got the biggest kind of productive economy of all the districts relative to the size of the economy, etc. But I haven't got time to get into all of this. But this is just showing you what we did. So we went into all 44 districts. We went into the 8 metros, and we did a lot of this kind of data. So you can see Sarah Bartman, because we're here, it's a 28 billion rand GVA, and then we broke that down by sectors. You'll see that, but you'll see there, sorry, I just want to go back up. The growth is very weak in Sarah Bartman. So 10-year growth is 0.68. So growing at less than 1%, this region, growing even slower than South Africa as a whole. And over the last 5 years, not growing actually, 0.02. So flatlining here at the moment for the last 5 years. And obviously, inflation and population growth. And so you can imagine per capita incomes are crashing. So I'm sure people are really feeling it here in this region in terms of cost of living crisis, etc. And then we did 50 sector analysis. So that's, if you look at the other alternative, what government uses to plan are the DDMs, the district development models, district development plans. Those give you very general sort of 10 sector analysis. So we did for DTIC, we went and did sort of 50 sector analysis. So at least you can see what's actually going on in each of your district economies, what's growing, what's not growing across, 50 sectors and subsectors. And so I won't tell you that whole picture and where investment is going. So you can see, so for example, let me just go there. You'll see the sector that's most hit, obviously catering and accommodation, which has dropped by 15% over the last 5 years. The last 5 years, obviously COVID, etc. And you can see which ones are growing, where investment is being, where investment is going, which sectors and which industries, subsectors and industries, and where your areas of comparative advantage are. Because we've got to know what pertains at local level. That's what we have to get behind, what's actually going on the ground. And we've got to know what's going on the ground. Up to date, industrial policy hasn't been, hasn't had that intelligence, if I can say that, to know what's going on, where to support, how to support, and that's really where LED's gone wrong. Okay, I'm right at the end. So what must change? I think firstly, we have to prioritize industrial policy. So that's the next 30 years. We haven't prioritized industrial. It must be the apex priority. It can't be another priority. It has to be the apex priority. It must drive economic transformation away from this path dependency we've got. We've got to align policy instruments with what exists on the ground. Because at the moment, your policy instruments are SEZs, industrial parks, clusters, but they're not aligned to supporting what we actually have in local spaces. We've got to know what we've got, what's going on the ground. How do we get behind and build on those capabilities, expand and deepen what we have? We've got to align, obviously, to future demand, green industrialization. And I think there's a lot of potential around this, and obviously moving more into high productivity, innovation-led, moving away from sort of from petrochems to biocomposites and all of that. That's kind of where the future is if we're not in that space. So we've got to align, or let me not say we've got to align. The national system of innovation must be led by industrial policy. At the moment, you've got these disconnects. The same with our labor market policies must be led by industrial policy. You can't have separate labor market policies. Labor market policy must be guided by where the economy is going vis-a-vis industrial policy. We've got localization, and at its most rudimentary, it translates into the 30%, 30%. And 30% without building supply side capabilities is actually a disaster, So as much as we want to co-create markets, set aside targets, etc., if it's not matched by building, by productivity enhancement and building productive capacity, you're actually going to do a disservice ultimately, And I think we're seeing that everywhere with service delivery and the like. But also, if we want to get corporates to buy into through enterprise supply development, etc., the state has to come to the party to build that kind of capability, working with it. Much more incentives outside of just the automotive. We really need incentives also for rural industrialization, township industrialization, etc. A new model for industrial parks and SEZs, in more enabling macroeconomic policy. Again, it can't be we guided by it. It must be guided. And then you're not going to do anything with my last point. You're not going to do anything, with where you've got threats of state capture or the reality of state capture and corruption. And I think, you're never going to get your state-owned companies working efficiently where we've got the levels of corruption that we have in the state-owned companies, in municipalities, etc., etc. My last slide. What is the class agency, though, for this new economic transformation model, if I can call it that. You know, because at the moment you've got the old sort of traditional rent-seeking elites and the new sort of aspirant rent-seeking elites having some kind of comfortable coexistence, if I can say that, over the last 30 years, but coming to a head now over the last sort of 10 years as the cake has shrunk, you know. But what would be the new sort of elite compact if we were to use that sort of language, you know? And I know Moletsi and Becky, for example, writes a lot about that currently neither of the sort of elites, whether it's the old traditional white elite or the new aspirant sort of bureaucratic bourgeoisie, as it were, neither of them have an interest in growing productive capability. They don't have an interest in industrial policy, you know, because the old elite is vested in financial assets and the like, and the new elite is vested in sort of state rents and the like. So how do we kind of build what would be that driver? And then what's the role of community organizations, social movements, trade unions in this? I think let me stop there. I've spoken about some of these things. Thanks very much.
Yeah, and Andrew, thanks very much. Andrew, thanks very much. And there's a lot to think about there. What we do at this stage is we take some questions, and we prefer to do it in a bundle. So in other words, we will take a few hands and then allow the speaker to respond. Take a few hands, we'll do a round or two. And then, of course, this will also give you an opportunity to raise some of the things you haven't raised there. And Valence, you will also let us know if there are any things in the question. Okay. Let me go to the two that were put in the chats first, Andrew.
Okay.
The one was from Glenn Robbins, who said, unfortunately, I have to leave the seminar. Thank you for the thought-provoking input. The comment about how our future industrial/economic policy supports building a more diversified economy in sector terms, spatially, skills, ownership, is a real challenge. I think this is a commenter, is saying the comment is about how our policy supports that we need is a real challenge, and we have failing systems of public good infrastructure. So I think that's a general comment. We have a question there from Alfred Mapaleka at Kasatu. Picture is so gloomy. Looks like getting positive change suggests it's not even possible. Who are the players here to change all this? In Treasury, I've got Ngwana. Trade and Industry, I have Patel. These should be our guys. But at the moment they get here, are they part of the furniture? Question mark. Neil Coleman at IEJ. There's a growing narrative among conservative mainstream economists that industrial policy has failed. Full stop. For example, Tim Cohen's editorial. How would you respond to this? And there's another comment by, I can't see the name, I think Zoltan Jafta. We need hygiene in our politics. Just a comment. All right, I think we can take two from the House, and then Andrew can respond. And let me leave the podium to you. Let's take two from the House. Andrew, do you want to come to the front again? Oops. Yeah. Let's just, I've noted two hands here, but I also want to encourage comrades and attendees who maybe haven't asked before, so not to be too shy. Are you pointing to someone there? Okay, let's take, first we get a question from Ms. Bukajata. You've been nominated.
Thanks. Ms. Bukajata from the Savannah Public Institute. Two questions. You made a point about an assumption in the latter day shifts of the national policy, an assumption about the central role of the local state, also given the elite mandate for that state institution. I think it's complicates the big way because local state is probably the weakest component of the state. As in my conversation on WhatsApp now, I have on he makes the point that the local state also gets the lowest level of fiscal transfers from the central state. And I just wanted to push you further to take us further and then you state. And then my final question is about another complication, which is this big debate on the just transition and towards industrialization. If it's assumed on the model of the 19th and 20th century, does not necessarily go together with the notion of just transition. So how do you treat and factor the just transition into the program on the next step of the my question is, let's have unfriendly policies. Let's have one, the government lack of arrogant investing on SMEs. Comrades from the trade union who are part of government, not necessarily threatening government to take a stance that is going to favor as alliance partners. Which one would you say is the reason why this mess? Because if government is going to, if you're going to come up, you are going to hear statistics like, I'm not xenophobic, but I don't think it's the best. If you're going to come across the statistic that 99.9% of spas are shopping township are foreign moved, and we have a small business enterprise ministry. I think township economy, but then on the ground is not the case. So good thing they tend to fall down the fact that government is not arrogant in the on small business. I think this crisis of then policies that are not friendly can be avoided. So which one would you say is aiming? Again, anyway, there's something that which I always don't understand, but I could start after this where South Africa and China think the partner is China. Then you see the difference of Chinese, like physically coming to this country, standing there. And I always ask this question. Why don't we do this in China, like in the streets of China? So there's not all those factors of partnership that only favors those and not necessarily simply down. The city is not the country. Which one is the thing that these three factors? I'm going to take one more question. Then you've got quite a lot. Yes.
Thanks, Tom. My name is more open edition. The lowest layer of our sphere, which is the municipalities per se, are getting the smallest share because of these three spheres that we have. Mine is to ask, is it still relevant for us in this day and time to have the second sphere of government? Because if you look at this, the share of all these is taken more by the provincial, which in essence, it does not do what is expected of them to do. They then share some of the is that are supposed to be done to say they must be done by the municipalities. Municipalities knowing fully well that the share that went to the municipalities is lesser than what they got. And also looking at the issue of e-roads, that is the roads that are supposed to be done by the provincial department. Which roads? Those roads are in tatters. There are no potholes. They are just like izinto ezihojiweyo, showing ukuthi there is no maintenance. Although imali iphaya, do we really need the second sphere of government? That's a question. I'm not throwing it to you. I'm throwing it to us as the labor. That do we really need the second sphere of government?
We have noted some other questions, but I think there's more than enough for Andrew to get into there.
Yeah, thanks, comrades, for those really kind of thought-provoking points and questions. I think just the Glenn's, those were more kind of points, I think. But I think I'll pick up on some of them, because I think some of the comrades asked some of the same issues around failing infrastructure and the like, and what some of the solutions could be for to address that situation. On Alfred's point around, maybe it was a kind of a gloomy presentation I gave, but I'm not so much a gloomy person, even though the focus was on sort of the absence of economic transformation. But I think maybe I'll touch and I'll come to some of the issues in the small business space as well. I think there are things going on, just like I was showing you, and I could show you any district or any metro. There's tons of stuff. Even your smallest district, has maybe a 2 billion rand or 1.5 billion rand manufacturing. There's manufacturing gross value added in that. There's things happening everywhere, but it's like those things are being allowed to kind of peter out, So it's like, how do we actually kind of know and appreciate what's going on and get behind those things that are actually happening? Where people are producing, we need to be getting behind them. That's where the municipality needs to be sort of activating its LED, etc., and looking at, okay, so you've got this happening. Can we deepen the impact of that? Are there local suppliers we can develop to feed into that, instead of just ignoring that, because those are factories in an industrial park and our focus is this? So somehow we have to kind of make that connect. On Neil's question, look, I mean, it's interesting the point you're saying, because I was saying the same thing. Largely industrial policy has I won't say failed, because it's halted the decline in a lot of industries, and it's given us, automotive sector and particularly food and bev and others have done okay, but it hasn't diversified the economy enough, and it hasn't transformed the economy away from our sort of path dependency. So you could say yes, it hasn't succeeded, but I would come at it from a very different causal explanation. It isn't that industrial policy has failed because it's industrial policy. It's failed because it hasn't been the lead policy. It's because we haven't prioritized it enough that it's failed. It hasn't been able to lead the rest of government policy, macroeconomic policy, infrastructure, skills, etc. That's why it's been far less effective than it has been. Whereas I think the right-wing argument will be it's failed because we don't need industrial policy anymore. But funnily enough, I think around the world, even though you saw a massive retreat from industrial policy in the sort of heyday of neoliberalism in the 1990s and early 2000s, you've actually seen industrial policy coming back on the table in most kind of industrialized countries and developing economies. You know? So I think that's an absolute nonsense argument to say it hasn't worked, therefore we don't need it. You know, I think exactly the opposite. It hasn't worked as it should. We need it, and we need to make it the apex policy, you know, that leads the others. So probably same conclusion, very different analysis and very different conclusions, if I can say that. I agree on the hygiene in politics. You know, I didn't get into state capture and all of the impacts that state capture has had. But if you look at the sort of developmental state models and you look at East Asia, for example, particularly the kind of government-linked companies, the GLCs and the likes of Singapore, those state companies, they operate on bottom line principles. They attract the best, most competent, technically competent and proficient CEOs to head them up, and absolutely zero tolerance for corruption. And if you don't have those as your kind of basic ingredients, you're not going to have, the state is not going to be able to do what the state needs to do. So what we've done, because our developmental state, as it were, it's like industrial policy, because the developmental state has failed, because of corruption, and because we've put less than competent people in positions of power to run some of these entities, etc., etc. Now the right-wing argument kicks in. You don't need a developmental state, cut back these state-owned companies. Let private sector move in and take over utilities provisioning, etc., etc. So again, it's the same argument with industrial policy. We've shot ourselves in the foot, and now, we're getting the pushback. The same with state-owned companies, the developmental state model. I would argue more than ever we need a developmental state, because the private sector and markets will not address the issues that were raised around the township economy. They won't go there. We're seeing that already. I was saying banks have got an impairment tolerance of 1%. So forget it. You will not get a startup. You will not get a loan from a bank. You will not get credit. The SMME credit gap is 500 billion rand in the country. 500 billion rand. That's the gap that currently exists in the market. Yet banks return money to their shareholders. They return money to their shareholders. We're sitting with all of these trillions of rand that we're not investing where it needs to go in the economy. So that's what the market does. If you don't have a state that is prepared to take risk and, face the consequences of that, and that would be tolerating higher impairment, for example. You've got to creating first loss facilities, credit guarantees, all of these kind of things that can bring the banks and the private. I'm not saying the state must compete with the private, but the state must, must leverage the private through taking the risk. Private will not do that. So we 100%, we need a developmental state now more than ever. You're not going to get the economic transformation without a developmental state. On the local state, there were a lot of questions on the local state. Agree completely, It's where we have the least capability. It's the least resourced. The model is around revenue, own revenue generation to fund operations, and then you get small grants from national transfers and the like. The metros are supposed to be totally revenue driven outside of some of the infrastructure money you get. Now we know you need to have collection rates. I don't know what the collection rate here is in Makana. And the one thing I always say for municipalities, if you as comrades, if you're going to monitor your local state and see the effectiveness and the efficiency of the local state, the things you must pay attention to. One, is the collection rate. You know, what percentage of the rates and tariffs that should be collected are being collected. And if you're dropping down, I know I used to do work for Buffalo City through a technical support program. They used to be kind of 90%, you know, then went down to 80%. Then COVID hit, went down to 40%. Then back up to 70%, now down to 60%, whatever. You're not going to be able to finance infrastructure, new infrastructure maintenance, etc., etc. That's the funding model, though, that we have, you know. And with the unemployment going up, cost of living crisis, people are not able to pay rates and tariffs. That's what's happening everywhere, you know. And what you're finding is stemigration happening in South Africa at the moment, with people and businesses moving to certain municipalities, and those municipalities becoming more sustainable and the rest becoming much less sustainable. And something, again, has to give. The model has to change. So I agree with you completely. We need to be rethinking our model. For me, I agree, you've got way too much fat in the system. So national government, provincial government, you know, you've got tons of administrators, you know, extremely well-paid bureaucrats. You could cut those hugely, but you don't cut your frontline services, your teachers, your police, you know, your municipal workers who go and read the water meters, etc. You need your frontline workers. In fact, you need to be increasing the numbers of frontline employees in the state. We've seen Michael Sachs has done some really great work which actually shows that our frontline workers, you know, the numbers have been coming down, which accounts for some of the service delivery challenges. So if we're going to cut, you cut at the level there, and you can use sort of smart systems to do a lot of the administrative work that administrators are doing. So I think we've got an overly administrative heavy state that we need to kind of think through. The issue on the just transition, look, I think that's you know, look, I like the green industrialization, which kind of links the green transition, which is inevitable. It's happening. It has to happen, because otherwise we're not going to be able to trade with the rest of the world, etc., etc. So we are going that route, and you are finding renewable prices becoming more and more competitive over time. So we are going that route. You see now 6 gigawatts of renewable being put into the system, with the embedded generation thresholds being changed, etc., etc. But what we're not seeing at the moment is the industrial policy linkages to that. You know? So what is that value chain, and how do we kind of build a component industry around that green industrialization? So it almost kind of took us by surprise, I think, this massive kind of renewable. We were all like holding back. There was all the wind projects, a couple of big solar projects, and then boom. It's crazy what's going on at the moment. But all of those components, you know, we're importing. A lot of them we're importing. But definitely going forward on the sort of battery side, the lithium battery, and we've got the critical minerals. It's a big resource. So let me say this: there's stuff to be optimistic about as well. You know, we are resource endowed. We've got a lot of those critical minerals. We're moving into the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and I think that's a good thing to see ourselves, because we need scale. You know, we've got a small population. If we start thinking of ourselves much more in continental terms and looking at, even though we are kind of an early a deindustrializer as a country, we still have competitiveness, industrial competitiveness on the continent. So it's like, how do we kind of leverage that? And I think that, so for me, it's about having those kind of new models. But at the moment, the just transition is very much just about, you know, Mpumalanga, you know, saving jobs. I don't think it's sufficiently around industrial policy and green industrial policy. And I think that's a kind of big area. The last question I wanted to speak to is the issue of the spaza shops and the township economy. Look, I mean, the townships currently, you've got 60% of South Africa's unemployed live in townships. So townships are, you've got to kind of focus on townships. You know, you've got industrial parks adjacent to townships. A lot of those industrial parks have deindustrialized. I know DTIC has been trying to resuscitate a lot of those industrial parks. Again, the model is that municipalities run those, look after them. They haven't been doing those. So assets get stripped, vandalism, etc., etc. So we need to be thinking about new models of running industrial parks. We've got very well-run SEZs, high secure, etc. And then we've got these industrial parks. The industrial parks are where we need to be incentivizing labor-intensive industry into those. And we need to be thinking about how to activate those, because we've got this, you know, huge kind of distance between townships and the sort of economic nodes in our cities, etc., etc. The other thing is, how do you grow township economies themselves? So, you know, township economies don't have high streets. They don't have kind of economic zones. You know, you've got to kind of rethink the spatial side of townships and put the sort of regulations in place, new regulations that actually can attract investment into those spaces. So we've got to kind of rethink townships away from being sort of the old dormitory labor reserves, which they were developed as, to being economies in their own rights, you know. And at the moment, and it's a pity that it comes down to that, it's sort of cast as a foreign versus, you know, local spaza issue. Whereas I think, yes, there are all the illicit trading issues, there are the counterfeit goods issues, there's complete lack of regulation. And again, that's municipalities, because that's where your local regulation happens, you know. So, you know, it's not only LED that we've set ourselves up for failure. It's the business licensing, it's the regulation. All of that stuff's supposed to all be happening at local level. And you're right, it's where we've got the least capacity. So we've got to kind of rethink our models. And I think, you know, I suppose this is where we need to be thinking in terms of like capacitating the local state. So you know, I don't think, and look, there are these interventions, etc. And you've got one here that's been going on for years, Makana. I'm not sure where Makana is going now. But I mean, where you've got provinces and where provinces don't intervene, you've got national coming in. I think those things have very kind of mixed results, you know. They might show a little bit of improvement, and then there's decline, etc., etc. So I think it's also about people, civil society, residents, local business stepping up. And I suppose that's the space we're in at the moment, you know. It's like, how do you actually now and partners probably a soft word, you know, but how do you actually get involved in your space, you know? And it could be around, you know, and it's not acknowledging that the state's failing and therefore we have to do this, which is kind of, you know, business for South Africa. We have to step in because the state can't do it. We're going to have to step into that space. But I think it's also about making sure there's more accountability, you know? Making sure that the budgets, when the budgets are developed, you see there's budgets for potholes, there's budgets for township industrial parks, there's budget, you know, there's zoning that happens in the township economy that creates those sort of zones and economic hubs in townships where people can trade. And I think, you know, if we're not showing interest in those issues, if we think we've elected these councillors, they're going to then just, you know, make sure these things happen. I think that's the wake-up call that the last 30 years have taught us, you know. So I think for me, it's about, like, you know, they talk about sort of participatory democracy. I think we've got this sort of a system, we vote every couple of years, then we sit back and complain. But I think those days are over in South Africa. So if we don't get involved in the spaces we're in, you know, as activists, as social movements, as trade unions, you know, then we're all part of the problem as well, I think, you know. So maybe that's the kind of the paradigm shift, if I can say that maybe we have to have. I've steered clear of the role of provinces. Look, provinces are, it was a big debate. It's dropped off the debate. Provinces are very powerful politically, you know, obviously because your party structures are provincial. You know, I know we've had quite powerful party barons over the years coming out of provinces into national politics, etc., etc. So they probably politically they're more sort of important, if I can say that, than administratively. You know, you could, you know, mostly what provinces do is health and education, little bit of economic stuff on the side. But if it's about delivering health and education services primarily, there might be better ways to deliver it where you get better bang for buck. Provincial legislatures, etc. I mean, I think we're running out of money as a country unless we sort of shift our macroeconomic policy stance. If we continue with our existing stance, there's going to be some big restructuring of the state that happens. And I think from a progressive kind of COSATU, social movement, union, community-based structure perspective, we've got to make sure that the frontline service delivery components are not affected. You know, that's what we have to safeguard, I think, as the kind of budget cuts start coming in as we get deeper into austerity. Yeah, let me stop there.
Okay. No, I think there may be some other questions. I've noted some from the group, which I'll share directly with Andrew, and other people I'd like to encourage you to come ask him afterwards. I think we need to draw it to a close now. I think there's a lot of food for thought, and maybe it's an optimistic point to actually end, because I think what I'm getting from what Andrew's saying is there are things happening, that the mood of lassitude and of cynicism, we must also see there are green shoots. We could say he speaks about the era of state capture. That implies that there have been some reforms since then, and there have. There are businesses, there are civil society organizations trying to make things work. There are people in the government who are trying to make things work. And I think let's think about that and consider what the possibilities are, because sometimes we can get paralyzed with the problems. And I think the politics of fear is something to be very, very careful about. If we give up hope in dark days, the dark days will last longer. With that, I'd like us to give a big round of applause to Andrew. I